before the music, before the city. Tonight, we're going to travel back in time to a place that did not yet have a skyline, a place without highways, without recording studios, without neon lights glowing along Broadway, a place where no one had yet called it Music City. Long before Nashville became known for country music, before steamboats traveled the Cumberland River, before railroads connected Tennessee to the wider nation, this landscape existed in a quieter form. The story begins not with buildings, but with a river. The Cumberland River winds through Middle Tennessee in broad curves, flowing through hills, forests, and valleys before eventually joining larger waterways on its journey toward the Gulf of Mexico. For thousands of years, long before the arrival of European settlers, this river shaped the lives of the people who lived alongside it. If we could step backward through time and stand here centuries ago, the scene would feel very different from the Nashville of today. There would be no city lights, no bridges crossing the water, no distant sounds of traffic. Instead, the landscape would be dominated by forests stretching to the horizon. Towering hardwood trees covered much of the region. Oak, hickory, walnut, maple, and sycamore created a vast canopy that changed with the seasons. In spring, fresh green leaves unfolded overhead. In autumn, hillsides glowed with shades of gold, orange, and crimson. The Cumberland River moved steadily through this landscape, sometimes calm and reflective, sometimes swollen with seasonal rains. Wildlife thrived here. White-tailed deer moved through forest clearings. Black bears occasionally wandered the woodlands. Wild turkeys scratched through fallen leaves. Beavers built lodges along streams and wetlands. Passenger pigeons, now long extinct, once traveled in enormous flocks so large that they could darken the sky. The land that would someday become Nashville was not empty. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples lived throughout the region. They hunted, fished, traded, traveled, and built communities across the Cumberland Valley. Rivers served as natural highways, connecting distant settlements and creating networks of exchange that stretched far beyond what is now Tennessee. Generations came and went. Seasons passed. The forests continued growing. The river continued flowing. Long before maps labeled this place, people understood its value. The Cumberland provided water, transportation, fertile soil, and access to abundant wildlife. Trails crossed the region, linking communities and allowing movement through the wilderness. Some of these paths would later influence roads built by settlers centuries afterward. As evening settled across the valley, the sounds would have been remarkably different from those of a modern city. Wind moving through trees, water flowing over rocks, birds calling from the forest canopy, the distant sounds of insects rising after sunset. For countless generations, these natural rhythms defined life here. Then, slowly, change began to arrive. Far to the east, European colonies expanded along the Atlantic coast. Settlements grew larger. Populations increased. Explorers pushed farther inland in search of land, resources, and opportunity. At first, the Cumberland region remained distant from these developments. It existed beyond the edge of most colonial settlements, separated by mountains, forests, and long stretches of wilderness. To many people living along the Atlantic coast, this part of North America seemed unimaginably remote. Yet stories traveled. Hunters returned with tales of fertile valleys and abundant game. Explorers described rich soil and navigable rivers. Traders carried news of lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The Cumberland Valley gradually became known as a place of possibility, not because it was easy to reach. In fact, reaching it was often difficult and dangerous, but because those who visited saw potential, a place where new communities might someday grow, a place where rivers connected distant regions, a place where opportunity seemed to stretch as far as the forests themselves. The transformation would not happen overnight. The city we know today would emerge slowly, one generation at a time. First came hunters and explorers, then settlers, then cabins and roads, then riverboats, businesses, schools, churches, and neighborhoods. Over time, a frontier settlement would become a town would become a capital would become a transportation center, and eventually, Nashville would become one of the most recognizable cities in America. But all of that lies ahead. For now, let us remain here for a moment longer. The forests are still unbroken. The river still flows through a landscape untouched by city streets. The hills are quiet beneath the evening sky. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the first settlers have not yet arrived. The story of Nashville has not yet begun, but the land where it will unfold is already waiting. The frontier on the Cumberland. Long before Nashville became a city, before roads crossed the hills of Middle Tennessee, and before settlements appeared along the Cumberland River, this region existed at the edge of what many European colonists considered the known world. To those living along the Atlantic coast in the 18th century, the land west of the Appalachian Mountains seemed distant and mysterious. Maps showed broad stretches of wilderness. Stories described endless forests. Rumors spoke of fertile valleys, rich hunting grounds, and rivers that wound through landscapes few settlers had ever seen. For generations, the Appalachian Mountains had formed a natural barrier between the established colonies and the interior of North America. Crossing them was difficult. Roads were few. Trails were rough. Travel often required weeks of effort through rugged terrain. Yet people continued to push westward. Some came seeking land. Others sought opportunity. Many simply wanted to know what lay beyond the horizon. Among the earliest Europeans to enter the Cumberland region were men known as long hunters. The name came from the length of their expeditions. Unlike ordinary hunting trips that might last days or weeks, these journeys often lasted several months and sometimes stretched for nearly a year. Long hunters traveled deep into the wilderness carrying rifles, supplies, and knowledge passed between generations of frontiersmen. Their goal was often practical. Animal pelts commanded high prices in eastern markets. Deer hides, in particular, were valuable commodities. A successful expedition could provide a substantial income for a hunter willing to endure the hardships of frontier travel. But these journeys also expanded geographic knowledge. The hunters followed rivers, crossed valleys, and mapped routes through unfamiliar territory. They returned with descriptions of landscapes that many colonists had never seen. Among the places that attracted attention was the Cumberland Valley. The region offered fertile soil, abundant wildlife, and access to a major river system. Forests stretched across rolling hills. Streams fed into larger waterways. Open meadows appeared between wooded ridges. To many visitors, it seemed like a place where future settlements might flourish. One of the best-known long hunters associated with the area was Daniel Boone. Although Boone is often remembered for his exploration of Kentucky, he and other frontier travelers helped spread knowledge of the broader region beyond the Appalachians. Their stories encouraged settlers to consider moving westward into lands that had previously seemed remote and inaccessible. As reports circulated, interest in the Cumberland region grew. The journey remained difficult, but the rewards appeared promising. Families living in crowded eastern settlements heard accounts of fertile farmland and abundant natural resources. Land ownership, which was becoming increasingly difficult in some established areas, seemed more attainable on the frontier. The West began to feel closer. Not geographically, perhaps, but imaginatively. People could now picture these distant valleys and rivers. They could imagine building homes there, planting crops there, raising families there. The idea of settlement began long before the settlement itself. Travel through the frontier was rarely easy. A typical expedition involved crossing mountains, navigating rivers, enduring harsh weather, and carrying supplies through dense forests. Travelers often slept outdoors or in temporary shelters. They relied heavily on hunting, fishing, and careful planning. A simple mistake could have serious consequences. An injury, a lost trail, or spoiled provisions could quickly turn a difficult journey into a dangerous one. Yet despite these challenges, movement into the region continued. The Cumberland River played a particularly important role. Flowing through the heart of what would eventually become Middle Tennessee, it provided a natural route through the landscape. Rivers were often the most efficient highways available during the 18th century. They allowed people and goods to move more easily than overland travel through dense forests. For explorers and settlers alike, the Cumberland represented possibility. Its waters connected distant places. Its valleys offered fertile ground. Its presence suggested permanence. Along its banks, future communities could grow. At this point in history, however, the region remained largely undeveloped from a European perspective. The forests still dominated the landscape. The sounds of nature remained uninterrupted by towns or industry. At dawn, mist rose from rivers and streams. Deer moved quietly through clearings. Birds filled the canopy with song. Evenings brought long shadows across the hills as the wilderness settled into darkness. It was a landscape governed by natural rhythms. Sunrise and sunset. Season and weather. River and forest. The frontier existed in a state of possibility. Nothing was yet certain. No city stood where Nashville would someday rise. No Capitol building overlooked the Cumberland. No music drifted from stages or radio stations. Those developments remained far in the future. Yet the conditions that would make Nashville possible were already present. The river was here. The land was here. The routes through the wilderness were beginning to emerge. And most importantly, people were beginning to imagine a permanent future along the Cumberland. That imagination would soon become reality. Small groups of settlers would gather their belongings and begin one of the most ambitious migrations of their lives. They would leave behind established communities and venture into a landscape that still felt wild and uncertain. The decision would not be easy. The journey would not be safe. But the promise of a new beginning was powerful, and somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond the forests, and beyond the winding bends of the Cumberland River, a settlement was about to be founded, a settlement that would eventually become Nashville. As the winter of 1779 approached, a group of settlers made a decision that would shape the future of Middle Tennessee. They would leave behind the relative security of established communities and travel into the Cumberland Valley to create a new settlement on the frontier. It was an ambitious undertaking. The land they sought was hundreds of miles from the more populated regions of the American colonies. Roads were limited. Communication with the outside world would be difficult. Supplies would be scarce. And the challenges of surviving in an unfamiliar wilderness would test every skill they possessed. Yet they moved forward. Among the leaders of this effort was James Robertson, a frontiersman with extensive experience navigating the rugged lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. Robertson had already helped establish settlements in the region and believed that the Cumberland Valley offered tremendous potential for future growth. Another important figure was John Donaldson, who organized a remarkable river journey to bring settlers and supplies into the area. The migration took place in two parts. Robertson led a group overland through the wilderness, guiding settlers along difficult trails and through challenging winter conditions. Meanwhile, Donaldson led a flotilla of boats carrying families, livestock, tools, and provisions along a lengthy river route. Their journey followed waterways that connected to the Cumberland River, eventually bringing them toward their destination. The river expedition was particularly demanding. Travel by water offered certain advantages, but it also presented significant risks. Boats had to navigate unfamiliar currents, changing water levels, and numerous natural obstacles. Harsh winter weather added further difficulties. Days often passed slowly. The settlers drifted along broad stretches of river, surrounded by forests that seemed endless. At night they camped along riverbanks, gathering around fires while listening to the sounds of the wilderness around them. For many travelers, the journey represented a leap into the unknown. Few had ever seen the lands where they intended to settle. Most knew the region only through reports from hunters, explorers, and earlier travelers. Yet they continued forward. After months of travel, the settlers finally reached the Cumberland Valley. There, on a bluff overlooking the river, they selected a site for their new community. The location offered several advantages. The Cumberland River provided transportation and access to water. The surrounding land appeared suitable for farming. Nearby forests supplied timber for construction. The elevated position also offered a degree of protection and visibility over the surrounding landscape. The settlers immediately began the work of building. Their first priority was survival. Cabins needed to be constructed before winter conditions worsened. Food supplies had to be carefully managed. Crops would eventually need to be planted. Livestock required protection. Most importantly, the settlement needed defenses. Like many frontier communities of the era, the new settlement was organized around a fortified structure known as a stockade. Large wooden logs were placed upright to form protective walls surrounding a cluster of cabins and common spaces. This fortified settlement became known as Fort Nashborough. The name honored Francis Nash, a general who had served during the American Revolutionary War. Inside the fort, life was simple but demanding. Cabins were built from logs cut from nearby forests. Roofs were often covered with wooden shingles. Furniture was limited and usually handmade. Every object served a practical purpose. A typical day began before sunrise. Settlers tended fires, prepared meals, gathered water, and completed the countless tasks necessary to keep the community functioning. Men often worked on construction, hunting, farming, or maintaining defenses. Women managed households, prepared food, cared for children, made clothing, and performed countless other essential duties. Children contributed as well. From an early age, they learned skills necessary for frontier life. Gathering firewood, caring for animals, carrying water, and assisting with household tasks became part of daily routines. There was little room for idleness. Survival depended on cooperation. The first winter tested the settlement severely. Cold weather limited food supplies. Travel became more difficult. Isolation was a constant reality. Communication with distant settlements could take weeks or even months. Yet the community endured. The settlers relied heavily on one another. Neighbors shared labor, tools, and knowledge. If one cabin required repair, others often helped. If supplies ran low, cooperation increased the chances of survival. The frontier demanded a strong sense of community. No individual could easily succeed alone. Outside the fort walls, the surrounding landscape remained largely unchanged. Dense forests covered the hills. Wildlife moved through the river valley. Seasonal weather shaped every aspect of life. The settlers had established a foothold, but the wilderness still surrounded them on all sides. At night, after the day's work was complete, the settlement grew quieter. Fires flickered inside log cabins. The sounds of conversation drifted through the stockade. Beyond the walls, darkness settled over the Cumberland Valley. The river flowed steadily past the settlement, reflecting moonlight as it wound through the landscape. In those quiet moments, the settlers could not have fully known what their small frontier outpost would someday become. They were focused on immediate concerns: food, shelter, safety, the next season, the next harvest, the next winter. Yet history was already beginning to unfold around them. Fort Nashborough was still small. Its population was modest. Its future uncertain. But a permanent community had taken root along the Cumberland River. The difficult journeys had ended. The work of settlement had begun. And with every cabin raised, every field cleared, and every season survived, the foundation of Nashville grew a little stronger. The wilderness was still vast. The challenges remained many. But a new town now stood on the banks of the Cumberland. A town that would slowly expand beyond its wooden walls and eventually become one of the most influential cities in the American South. When most people imagine a frontier settlement, they often picture the dramatic moments: the arrival of settlers, the construction of cabins, the exploration of unknown land. But the truth is that most of life at Fort Nashborough was not dramatic at all. It was ordinary, and it was the countless ordinary days that allowed the settlement to survive. Once the first cabins had been built and the stockade walls stood around the community, the settlers faced a new challenge: creating a functioning society in the middle of the wilderness. Every morning began early. Long before sunrise, many families were already awake. Fires that had burned low during the night needed to be rekindled. Water had to be carried from nearby sources. Breakfast had to be prepared. Animals needed attention. The frontier allowed little opportunity for sleeping late. There was always work to be done. Inside the cabins, life was simple by modern standards. Most homes consisted of a single room constructed from hand-hewn logs. The walls were made from timber cut nearby. Gaps between logs were filled with clay and mud to help block cold air during winter. Furniture was often homemade. A family might own a rough wooden table, a few stools, simple shelves, and beds constructed from local materials. Mattresses were commonly stuffed with straw, dried grasses, feathers, or corn husks. Luxuries were rare. Practicality guided nearly every decision. Every item had to justify the effort required to bring it to the frontier or create it there. Food occupied a large part of daily life. Unlike modern cities, where food arrives from distant places with little thought from consumers, frontier families were responsible for producing or obtaining much of what they ate. Hunting remained important. Deer were among the most valuable sources of meat. Wild turkey, rabbit, and other game supplemented family diets throughout the year. Fishing also provided food from the Cumberland River and nearby streams. As fields were cleared, farming became increasingly important. Corn quickly emerged as one of the most reliable crops. Families also planted beans, squash, and other vegetables suited to local conditions. Gardens often sat close to cabins where they could be monitored and protected. Food preservation required careful planning. Fresh meat could spoil quickly, especially during warmer months. Smoking, drying, and salting helped extend the usefulness of valuable food supplies. A successful harvest or hunting season could make the difference between comfort and hardship during the winter months. Children learned these realities early. Frontier childhood involved responsibilities from a young age. Boys and girls often helped gather firewood, carry water, tend gardens, care for livestock, and assist with household chores. Formal schooling was limited during the earliest years of the settlement. So much learning occurred through observation and participation. Skills were passed directly from one generation to the next. A child might learn woodworking by helping build a fence, learn farming by planting alongside parents, learn hunting by accompanying older family members into the forest. Education often happened through doing. The surrounding wilderness remained an ever-present part of daily life. The forests provided timber for construction and fuel for fires. They supplied wild game, edible plants, and medicinal resources. Yet they could also present challenges. Storms occasionally swept through the region. Trees fell. Streams flooded. Weather changed rapidly. Settlers learned to pay close attention to natural signs. The sky, the wind, and the changing seasons all influenced daily decisions. Community cooperation remained essential. No family could easily accomplish everything alone. If a cabin needed to be raised, neighbors often gathered to help. When crops were harvested, multiple families sometimes worked together. Shared labor reduced burdens and strengthened relationships within the settlement. These gatherings also provided valuable social opportunities. Life on the frontier could be isolated. Neighbors might live farther apart than people were accustomed to in older communities. As a result, communal activities became important occasions for conversation, storytelling, and companionship. Evenings often brought a welcome change of pace. After a long day of work, families gathered around fireplaces inside their cabins. Meals were eaten. Repairs were made to clothing and tools. Stories were shared. In a world without electricity, screens, or modern entertainment, conversation became one of the most valuable forms of recreation. People spoke about the day's work. They discussed weather, crops, hunting, and plans for the future. They told stories from memory. Some stories came from personal experience. Others had traveled through families for generations. Outside, darkness settled quickly over the settlement. The stockade walls stood quietly beneath the stars. Beyond them stretched miles of forest. The sounds of the wilderness often filled the night. Owls called from distant trees. Insects sang from grasses and brush. The Cumberland River flowed steadily through the darkness. To modern ears, the silence might seem remarkable. There were no engines, no distant highways, no electric hum from a city. Only nature and the small sounds of human life gathered within the fort. As months passed, the settlement slowly became more stable. Additional cabins appeared. Fields expanded. Trails became more established. The routines of daily life grew more familiar. Yet Fort Nashborough remained a frontier community. Its future was still uncertain. The wilderness remained vast. The population remained small. Every season brought new challenges. But something important was beginning to take shape. The settlement was becoming more than a collection of cabins. It was becoming a community. People were building relationships alongside buildings, traditions alongside farms, a shared future alongside their shared labor. Many of the settlers likely focused only on the next season, the next harvest, or the next winter. Yet with each passing year, they were creating foundations that would outlast them. The fields they cultivated would someday become neighborhoods. The small settlement they struggled to maintain would continue growing long after they were gone. For now, however, Nashville was still simply Fort Nashborough, a frontier outpost surrounded by forest, sustained by hard work, and carried forward by the determination of the people who called it home. From settlement to town. In the earliest years of Fort Nashborough, life was defined by survival. By the time those first harsh seasons had passed, something subtle began to shift. Not suddenly, not in any dramatic way, but slowly, the settlement began to feel a little less temporary, and a little more permanent. At first, it was just the paths. The narrow trails between cabins that had once been shaped only by footsteps and necessity began to widen. Wagons passed more often. Horses followed more familiar lines. Mud was pressed down season after season until certain routes became recognizable roads. They were still rough, still uneven, but they stayed, and that alone made them different from the wilderness that once covered everything. As the 1790s moved forward, more families arrived in the Cumberland region. Some came from Virginia, others from North Carolina. They traveled for weeks, sometimes months, following river valleys and early frontier routes carved through the land. They came because land was available, because opportunity, even uncertain, still pulled people westward. Each new arrival changed the rhythm of the settlement. Another cabin went up. Another small field was cleared. Another smoke trail rose into the sky each morning. The settlement was no longer only the original group of survivors. It was slowly becoming a growing community. The land itself began to change alongside the people. Trees that had once stood unbroken along the riverbanks were cut and shaped into timber. Fields of corn and small gardens appeared where dense forest had been. The edge between wilderness and settlement became less sharp, more blended, more lived in. Even simple travel began to feel different. Where once there had only been uncertainty in every direction, now there were recognizable routes. A path to a mill, a path to a neighbor's farm, a path leading toward other small communities scattered through Middle Tennessee. Inside the settlement, early forms of organization began to appear. Nothing elaborate at first, just shared expectations. Simple systems for keeping track of land, for resolving disputes, for maintaining order when disagreements arose. In a place without established infrastructure, people had to create structure from necessity alone, and so they did. Small public buildings began to appear, simple wooden structures that served more than one purpose. A space might function as a courthouse one day, a meeting hall the next, and sometimes just a place for people to gather when important decisions needed to be made. These buildings were not grand. They were practical, built quickly, maintained carefully, but they represented something new, a sense that this place was not just surviving anymore. It was organizing itself. Around the same time, trade slowly began to take shape. A general store might appear at a crossroads. A blacksmith would set up a forge near the edge of settlement where smoke and heat would not disturb nearby homes. Carpenters repaired wagons. Mills processed grain from nearby farms. Each trade supported another. Each role became part of a growing system of daily life. Nothing moved quickly. Everything depended on distance, weather, and the limitations of frontier travel. But it moved, and that was enough. The Cumberland River remained central to everything. It was still the main connection to the wider world. Flatboats and small trading vessels drifted along its waters, carrying goods, carrying people, carrying news from distant places like New Orleans and beyond. For the people living along its banks, the river was both a boundary and a bridge, a constant presence that shaped how the town would grow. As more activity gathered near the riverfront, Nashville's identity began to shift. It was no longer just a fortified settlement. It was becoming a place of exchange, a place where goods, people, and ideas passed through and stayed. With time, civic life began to form more clearly. Local leaders emerged. Decisions were made about roads, land divisions, and public needs. There was still no modern system of government as we would recognize it today. But there was order and growing coordination. Families who once focused only on survival now began to think in slightly longer terms. Not just the next winter, but the next year, the next generation. Homes reflected this change as well. Cabins that were once purely functional began to show small signs of permanence. A second room might be added, a sturdier roof constructed, simple furnishings slowly replaced or improved over time. Nothing extravagant, but steadily improving. Children who grew up in these years knew both worlds. They remembered the older days of isolation and uncertainty. But they also experienced a settlement that was slowly becoming more structured, more predictable, more connected. Education remained informal, but life itself became the classroom. As roads improved, even slightly, travel between settlements became more common. Nashville was no longer isolated in the same way it once was. It was part of a wider network of frontier communities across Tennessee, each connected by rivers, trails, and shared experience. By the early 1800s, the transformation was clear. Nashville had outgrown its identity as Fort Nashborough. The wooden stockade still existed in memory, but the town that had formed around it no longer needed it in the same way. Streets were forming, even if they were still unpaved. Businesses were multiplying. Public life was becoming more defined, and people were no longer thinking of the settlement as temporary. They were beginning to think of it as home, a town along the Cumberland River, still young, still developing, still shaped by the land around it, but no longer just a frontier outpost. And as the river continued its steady flow past the growing settlement, Nashville quietly stepped into its next stage of life, without ceremony, without announcement, and without ever fully leaving behind the wilderness that shaped it. For a growing town, certain moments quietly change everything. They do not always arrive with celebration or spectacle. Sometimes they arrive through paperwork, through decisions made in distant rooms, through the slow unfolding of political life in a young nation still defining itself. For Nashville, one of those moments came with Tennessee's statehood in 1796. At that time, the region that would become Tennessee was still very much shaped by frontier life. Scattered settlements, wide stretches of forest, rivers serving as the main arteries of movement and trade. But statehood brought something new, a sense of structure, a sense that this land was no longer only a frontier. It was part of something larger, part of a state that needed organization, leadership, and a center of government. And so the question emerged, quietly at first, then more clearly over time. Where should the capital be? Nashville, still young but steadily growing along the Cumberland River, began to stand out as a practical choice. Its river access made it easier to reach than many inland settlements. Its central location within Middle Tennessee gave it balance between east and west regions of the state, and its steady growth suggested permanence, not just survival, but stability. When Nashville was chosen as the state capital, it marked a turning point in its identity. It was no longer just a local settlement adapting to frontier life. It was becoming a place where decisions for an entire state would be made. The change was not immediate in appearance. The town still looked much like it had before. Wooden buildings, dirt paths, simple homes and modest public spaces. But beneath the surface, its role had shifted dramatically. As the seat of government, Nashville began to attract new people. Lawmakers traveled in for legislative sessions. Officials came to conduct state business. Merchants and tradespeople followed, hoping to serve the growing needs of a political center. With them came new energy, new conversations, new demands placed upon the small but growing town. Public buildings became more important. Spaces for meetings, debates, and official records were needed more than ever. Simple structures that once served multiple purposes now began to take on more defined roles. Courthouses became places where laws were interpreted and disputes settled. Meeting halls filled with voices discussing the direction of a young state still finding its identity. Even the rhythm of daily life began to change. During legislative sessions, the town felt busier. Streets became more active. Inns and boarding houses filled with visitors. Local businesses saw increased demand, especially those near the center of town. Then, when sessions ended, the town would quiet again, returning to a slower, more familiar pace. This cycle became part of Nashville's early identity, a town that expanded and contracted with the movement of political life. At the same time, construction slowly increased. Being a capital required more than temporary arrangements. Buildings began to reflect a growing sense of permanence. Wooden structures were improved. Some were replaced. Others expanded to accommodate new functions. Nothing extravagant at first, but steadily more intentional, more stable. And as government activity increased, so did the importance of roads leading into the town. Travel routes that had once been informal paths through the wilderness were gradually widened and maintained more carefully. These roads connected Nashville not only to nearby farms and settlements, but to the broader state. Through them, ideas traveled as much as goods. Messages moved between communities. News of political decisions spread outward from the capital into the surrounding countryside. The Cumberland River continued to play its central role during this time. It remained one of the most important connections between Nashville and the wider world. Flatboats and trading vessels carried goods downstream toward larger markets. Upstream, they brought supplies, people, and occasional news from distant places. The river was still unpredictable at times, its currents shifting with the seasons, but it remained constant in its importance, a quiet highway through the landscape. As Nashville became more politically significant, its population slowly diversified, not in the modern sense of large-scale urban growth, but in the gradual arrival of people with different roles and purposes. Lawmakers, clerks, craftsmen, merchants. Each group added a layer to the town's developing structure. Homes reflected this gradual change. Some families began to build slightly larger houses, structures that suggested a longer-term presence. Rooms were added when needed. Repairs were made with more care. There was still no sense of rapid expansion, but there was a growing awareness that Nashville was not temporary. It was becoming established. Children growing up during this time experienced a town in transition. They still saw remnants of the older frontier days, but they also saw increasing signs of order and governance. They heard conversations about laws, state decisions, and public matters alongside the familiar topics of weather, farming, and daily labor. Without formal explanation, they were witnessing the formation of civic life. Education remained largely informal in many areas, but the presence of government encouraged more structured thinking about community and responsibility, even if slowly, even if unevenly. By the early 1800s, Nashville's role as Tennessee's capital had firmly shaped its direction. It was no longer just a river town that happened to host government functions. It was a center of political life in the region, a place where the future of a young state was being discussed and decided. Yet despite this growing importance, the town still retained much of its early character. The river still defined its edges. The forests still surrounded much of its expansion, and daily life still depended on the same rhythms of labor, weather, and season. Nashville had not left its frontier past behind. It was still shaped by it. But now, it carried something additional, a responsibility, a role beyond itself. And as the Cumberland River flowed steadily past the growing capital, Nashville continued its quiet transformation, balancing its old identity with a new one it was only just beginning to understand. For much of Nashville's early life, the Cumberland River was not just a feature of the landscape. It was the main connection to everything beyond it. A quiet, steady highway cutting through forests, hills, and open land. And in the early 1800s, it began to shape Nashville in a new and powerful way. As the town grew, so did the movement along the river. Flatboats appeared first. Simple wooden vessels, often built by the same people who used them. They were designed for one purpose, to carry goods downstream. Once loaded, they would drift with the current, moving slowly but steadily toward larger markets along the Mississippi River. In many cases, these boats were dismantled after completing their journey. The lumber would be sold or reused, and the travelers would often walk or ride back home overland. It was a one-way kind of travel, careful, intentional, and entirely dependent on the rhythm of the river. Keelboats came next, stronger, more structured, able to move both with and against the current, though still with great effort. These boats required crews who understood the river's behavior, where currents slowed, where hidden obstacles might appear beneath the surface, where sandbars shifted after storms and floods. Travel along the Cumberland was never completely predictable, but it was reliable enough to become essential. As more goods began to move through Nashville, the riverfront itself started to change. What had once been a quiet edge of wilderness became an active working space. Logs were stacked near the water. Barrels of flour, tobacco, and other local goods waited to be loaded. Small warehouses began to appear. Simple structures at first, built close enough to the river for easy access. They were practical buildings, focused on storage more than appearance. But they marked a shift in the town's identity. Nashville was becoming a place of exchange, not just a settlement where people lived, but a place where goods passed through, and where those goods connected the town to distant markets. Downriver, cargo eventually reached the Mississippi River, and from there, larger cities like New Orleans became part of Nashville's economic horizon. For the people living in the town, these connections felt distant, almost abstract. But they mattered deeply, because they meant that what was produced in the fields and workshops of Middle Tennessee could reach far beyond the local region. And in return, goods from other places could arrive in Nashville. Salt, tools, fabric, items that could not easily be produced on the frontier. This exchange slowly changed daily life. General stores became more common. They stocked goods that reflected a widening world. Shelves filled with items that had traveled farther than most of the people who used them. Merchants played an increasingly important role in the town. They served as both business owners and connectors, linking farmers, craftspeople, and travelers into a shared economic system, even if that system was still fragile, still developing, still dependent on weather, river levels, and the unpredictability of frontier transportation. Work along the river was constant. Loading and unloading goods required steady labor. Men carried heavy crates across uneven ground. Boats were prepared for departure when conditions allowed, and everyone watched the river closely, because it determined when travel was possible, and when it was not. At times, high water made movement easier, allowing boats to float more freely downstream. At other times, low water exposed sandbars and shallow channels that made passage difficult or even impossible. Storms could change everything overnight. A river that was calm one day might become dangerous the next. Yet despite these uncertainties, commerce continued to grow. Slowly, carefully, step by step. As trade increased, so did the need for organization. Markets became more structured. Goods were weighed, priced, and recorded with greater consistency. Local officials began to pay more attention to trade activity, especially as Nashville's role as a regional center expanded. The town was no longer only producing for itself. It was participating in a wider economic network, one that stretched far beyond the Cumberland Valley. With time, the riverfront developed a distinct rhythm. Morning activity often began early, as workers prepared boats or received incoming shipments. Midday brought movement between warehouses and stores. Evenings slowed, as the day's labor settled and the river returned to a quieter state. This rhythm repeated itself day after day, season after season, shaping the town's sense of time as much as clocks or calendars. And while much of this activity was practical, it also carried a sense of connection. People standing on the riverbanks could watch goods depart for distant places they might never see, and they could watch arrivals that carried traces of those same distant worlds back into their own. In this way, the Cumberland River became more than a route for commerce. It became a thread tying Nashville to places far beyond its borders. As the early 1800s continued, the town's relationship with the river only deepened. Warehouses expanded. Trade routes became more regular, and Nashville's importance as a transportation hub slowly strengthened. But even as commerce grew more complex, the setting remained grounded in simplicity. A river moving through land that still felt partly wild. A town growing beside it, learning how to balance nature, labor, and expansion. And at the center of it all, the steady flow of water carrying everything forward, quietly shaping the future of a city that was only beginning to understand its place in the wider world. As Nashville continued to grow through the early 1800s, something began to take shape that went beyond trade, politics, and river life. It was quieter than economic expansion, more gradual than population growth. But in time, it would become one of the defining parts of the city's identity. Education. In the early years, formal schooling in Nashville was limited. Most children learned at home or through small, informal arrangements. A neighbor might teach reading. A traveling instructor might offer lessons for a season before moving on. Knowledge was practical, often focused on reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. Skills needed for everyday life rather than academic study. But as the town stabilized and grew more established, the need for more structured education slowly became apparent. Families who planned to stay in Nashville long-term began to seek opportunities for their children beyond basic instruction. And with that demand, small academies began to appear. At first, these were modest institutions. A single room, a handful of students, a teacher who often carried multiple responsibilities, both educator and caretaker of the learning space itself. Lessons were simple but steady. Reading aloud from worn books. Practicing handwriting with ink and quill. Memorizing passages that would be recited from memory. These early schools were not large or formal by modern standards, but they represented something important. A shift toward permanence, toward investment in the future. As these academies became more common, Nashville slowly began to build a reputation that extended beyond its immediate region. Families in surrounding areas started to see the town not only as a place of commerce or government, but also as a place where education could take root. This reputation grew gradually, reinforced by the arrival of teachers, scholars, and religious instructors who saw opportunity in a growing capital city. Religious institutions also played a significant role in this development. Churches often served as centers of learning as well as worship. Sunday schools introduced basic literacy and moral instruction. Clergy members frequently contributed to broader educational efforts, helping to shape both curriculum and community values. In many ways, education in early Nashville was deeply connected to community life itself. There was no strict separation between learning and daily experience. A child might attend lessons in the morning, help with farm work in the afternoon, and hear stories or readings in the evening at home. Learning was continuous, integrated into the rhythm of life. As the early 1800s progressed, architecture in the town began to reflect a growing sense of cultural ambition. Some buildings started to adopt classical influences, columns, symmetry, designs that echoed ancient Greek and Roman styles. These choices were not accidental. They reflected a broader cultural aspiration, a desire to associate learning and civic life with the traditions of classical civilization. This influence would eventually contribute to Nashville's well-known nickname, the Athens of the South. The comparison was not about size or geography. It was about identity. Athens in ancient times had been associated with philosophy, learning, and civic discourse. Nashville, in its own developing way, began to position itself as a center for education and intellectual life in the southern United States. The nickname did not appear overnight. It emerged gradually, as institutions grew and as the town's reputation spread. Colleges and higher learning institutions began to take root in the region. These were still early and relatively small by modern standards, but they marked an important stage in the city's development. They attracted students from surrounding areas. They encouraged the growth of libraries and academic resources, and they helped establish Nashville as a place where education was not only present, but valued. Within the town itself, the presence of schools and academies changed daily life in subtle ways. Students moved through the streets with books in hand. Teachers became familiar figures in the community. Discussions about learning, literature, and knowledge became more common in households and public spaces. Even in a town still shaped by agriculture, trade, and river commerce, education began to occupy a visible and growing place. At the same time, Nashville's identity remained layered. It was still a capital city, still a river town, still connected to the rhythms of frontier life. But now it carried something additional, a sense of cultural ambition, a desire to be seen not only as functional or strategic, but as meaningful in a broader intellectual sense. This combination of roles, government center, trade hub, and emerging educational community, gave Nashville a distinctive character. Few towns in the region carried all three identities at once, and as a result, Nashville's reputation continued to expand beyond its immediate surroundings. Travelers passing through might notice not just the activity along the river or the presence of government buildings, but also the growing number of schools and institutions that suggested a deeper investment in the future. The phrase "Athens of the South" captured that impression. A town still young, still growing, but increasingly associated with learning and civic thought. Even so, life in Nashville remained grounded in the everyday. Farming still shaped the surrounding region. River trade still determined much of the town's economy. Families still lived in simple homes, balancing work, community, and survival. Education did not replace these realities. It grew alongside them, layered into the existing fabric of life. And as the Cumberland River continued to flow past the developing town, Nashville moved forward once again, quietly expanding not only in size and importance, but also in knowledge, culture, and identity, becoming something more than a frontier settlement, and something more than a capital city alone. As Nashville grew through the early 1800s, its landscape began to reflect a widening gap between different ways of life. On one hand, the town itself was becoming more structured, streets forming slowly from old paths, public buildings gaining permanence, commerce and government shaping daily activity along the river. But just beyond the center of town, life unfolded in a very different rhythm. Spread across the surrounding countryside were plantations, farms, and estates that defined much of Middle Tennessee's rural economy. These lands were often large, stretching across rolling hills and fertile soil that had drawn settlers to the region in the first place. Some families built substantial homes on these properties, structures that stood apart from the simpler log cabins of the earlier frontier period. These houses often reflected changing architectural influences, larger frames, more refined construction, occasionally inspired by classical design elements that were becoming more common in American civic architecture. Porches stretched across front facades. Windows were arranged with greater symmetry. Gardens were planted not only for food, but also for appearance and order. Inside these homes, daily life was structured differently than in the small cabins of early Nashville. Households often included extended family members as well as hired workers. Rooms were more divided. Spaces were assigned specific purposes. Dining, receiving guests, and private family life were separated in ways that reflected a growing sense of domestic formality. Yet despite these differences in structure, much of life still revolved around familiar routines. Work, meals, seasons, and weather remained central to daily experience. Agriculture formed the backbone of the regional economy. Tobacco, corn, and other crops were widely cultivated across plantations and smaller farms alike. The rhythm of planting and harvest shaped the entire year. Spring brought preparation and sowing. Summer required constant attention to fields. Autumn focused on gathering and storing crops. Winter offered a slower pace, often used for repairs, planning, and maintenance. Labor was an essential part of this system. On plantations, enslaved laborers carried out much of the physical work required to maintain large agricultural operations. They planted and harvested crops, maintained buildings and fields, managed the demanding, repetitive tasks that sustained the regional economy. Their lives were marked by hardship, limited autonomy, and constant labor under a system that defined much of the South during this period. This reality existed alongside the growth of towns like Nashville. Even as the city developed politically and economically, it was deeply connected to this broader agricultural system, and the contrast between different experiences of daily life remained a defining feature of the region. Within Nashville itself, smaller households lived at a different scale but still depended on the surrounding countryside. Farmers brought goods into town. Merchants supplied tools, fabric, and imported items. Carpenters, blacksmiths, and craftsmen supported both urban and rural needs. The town and countryside were closely linked. each relying on the other in different ways. Architecture within Nashville began to reflect this growing complexity. While many homes remained modest, some families constructed more substantial residences. These houses were not as large as rural estates, but they showed signs of increased stability and prosperity. Wooden frames were carefully built. Roofs were improved for durability. Simple decorative elements appeared, reflecting changing tastes and growing familiarity with national architectural trends. Gardens around homes became more common, not just for food production but also for appearance and comfort. Even in a developing town, there was a growing desire to create spaces that felt settled and established. Daily life inside these homes followed steady rhythms. Meals were prepared using ingredients from both local farms and river trade. Work was divided among family members, with responsibilities shifting throughout the day. Evenings often brought families together after long hours of labor. Candles and firelight provided the only illumination as the day ended early with the setting sun. Outside the homes and estates, the broader landscape remained a mixture of cultivated land and natural terrain. Fields gave way to forest. Clearings gradually expanded outward from settlements. Roads connected scattered properties, though travel could still be slow and affected by weather and terrain. Despite growing development, the region still retained much of its natural character. The balance between cultivated land and wilderness remained visible, and in many ways, that balance shaped how people understood their place in the world. Life was still closely tied to land, season, and environment. Even as Nashville itself became more structured and politically important, the surrounding region continued to reflect older patterns of rural existence. This combination of change and continuity defined the era. A growing town at the center, expanding farms and estates around it, and a landscape still shaped by both human effort and natural forces. As the Cumberland River continued its steady course nearby, it connected these different worlds, carrying goods between town and distant markets, linking rural production with urban exchange, and quietly reinforcing the connections that allowed both plantation life and city life to exist side by side. Nashville was no longer only a frontier settlement or a political center. It had become part of a broader regional system, one shaped by agriculture, trade, and layered social structures. And as the 19th century continued to unfold, these contrasts, between town and countryside, simplicity and refinement, labor and prosperity, would remain woven into the city's identity, shaping its growth in ways both visible and deeply embedded in daily life. By the mid-1800s, Nashville had grown into a city with many identities layered on top of one another. A river town, a commercial hub, a state capital, and a growing center of culture and education. But like much of Tennessee and the broader southern United States, it would soon be drawn into a conflict that would reshape everything around it. The Civil War did not arrive in Nashville as a single moment. It unfolded gradually, through rising political tension, through divided loyalties, through conversations in homes, churches, and public spaces that reflected a country pulling apart. Tennessee's path into the war was complicated. The state was deeply divided in its sympathies, with different regions holding different views on secession and the future of the Union. Middle Tennessee, where Nashville was located, found itself in a particularly uncertain position. The city was important enough to matter strategically, but also connected enough to both northern and southern economies that opinions were often split. When Tennessee ultimately seceded in 1861, Nashville's role changed almost immediately. As the state capital and a key transportation center, it became a strategic objective for Union forces. Its river access, its rail connections, its position in the region, all made it significant beyond its size. In 1862, Union forces occupied Nashville, making it one of the first major Confederate cities to fall under Union control. From that point forward, the daily life of the city changed in visible and invisible ways. Military presence became a constant feature of the landscape. Soldiers moved through streets that had once been primarily focused on trade and civic life. Buildings were repurposed for wartime needs. Schools, churches, and public structures were adapted into hospitals and administrative spaces. The rhythm of the city shifted. Where there had once been commerce and steady civic growth, there was now a sense of occupation and uncertainty. Supply wagons replaced some of the usual trade traffic. Military orders replaced civic announcements in importance. The river, once primarily a channel for commerce, also became a strategic route for movement and supply. Life for residents became more complicated. Everyday routines continued in some form, but under new conditions. Food supplies were less predictable. Prices fluctuated. Travel required greater caution and sometimes permission. Families adapted as best they could to changing circumstances. Some remained in the city under Union occupation. Others left temporarily, seeking safety in rural areas or neighboring towns. The population shifted in response to military presence and uncertainty. Even the physical landscape of Nashville began to reflect the war. Encampments appeared on open land surrounding the city. Fields that had once been used for agriculture were repurposed for military use. Roads saw a different kind of traffic, and the sounds of daily life were often mixed with the presence of marching soldiers, drilling exercises, and the movement of supplies. Inside the city, hospitals became especially important. Wounded soldiers from battles across the region were brought to Nashville for treatment. Churches and public buildings were converted into makeshift medical facilities. Doctors, nurses, and volunteers worked in difficult conditions, often overwhelmed by the scale of need. The war brought not only political and military change, but also a deep strain on the everyday functioning of the city. Yet even amid these conditions, Nashville did not stop functioning entirely. Markets continued in limited form. Local trade adapted to what was available. Communities adjusted to the reality of occupation and conflict. People found ways to continue daily life within the constraints of war. As the war progressed, Nashville's strategic importance remained constant. Its rail lines connected key parts of the region. Its river access supported movement of supplies, and its location made it a focal point for military planning and logistics. The city became not just a place where war was observed, but a place where war was actively managed. Over time, the presence of Union forces brought a degree of stability compared to the surrounding conflict zones, but it was a stability defined by military control rather than normal civic life. After the major battles and campaigns in the region, the city gradually settled into a quieter wartime existence, still occupied, still shaped by military presence, but less directly affected by active combat than some surrounding areas. As the war moved toward its end in 1865, Nashville began to transition once again. The end of the conflict did not immediately restore the city to its earlier form. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new and complex period. Reconstruction would bring its own challenges: economic recovery, social restructuring, and the slow process of rebuilding systems that had been disrupted or transformed by years of war. But even before that process fully began, Nashville stood at another turning point in its history. It had endured occupation. It had served as a strategic center during a national conflict, and it had experienced firsthand how quickly daily life could be reshaped by forces far beyond the riverbanks of the Cumberland. As peace returned, the city would once again begin to redefine itself, not as a frontier settlement, not only as a capital or trade hub, but as a place shaped by both its growth and its survival through one of the most difficult periods in American history. After the war, when the Civil War came to an end, Nashville did not suddenly return to the way it had been before. There was no clean reset, no simple return to earlier routines. Instead, the city entered a period of rebuilding that was slow, uneven, and shaped by the lingering effects of conflict. The war had changed more than just the physical landscape. It had altered economies, disrupted social structures, and left many communities trying to understand what the next version of daily life would look like. In Nashville, the first signs of change were practical. Buildings that had been repurposed during the war gradually returned to civilian use. Hospitals became schools again. Administrative offices shifted back toward local governance, and spaces that had once been filled with military activity slowly returned to civic life. But the transition was not immediate. Repairing physical damage took time, and even where buildings remained intact, their functions had to be re-established. One of the most important forces shaping this new period was the expansion of railroads. Before the war, rail lines had already begun to connect Nashville to other parts of the region. But after the conflict, railroad development accelerated rapidly. Tracks were repaired, extended, and integrated into larger transportation networks that stretched across the South and beyond. This transformation changed how the city functioned. The river was still important, but railroads offered speed and reliability that river travel could not always match. Goods that once depended on seasonal water levels could now move on fixed schedules. This shift made commerce more predictable and more expansive. Warehouses and industrial buildings began to appear near rail lines as well as along the riverfront. These areas became active centers of loading, storage, and distribution. The movement of goods became less dependent on natural conditions and more shaped by infrastructure. Alongside transportation changes, Nashville also experienced population growth. People returned after the war. Others arrived seeking opportunity in a rebuilding region. The city became a place where different experiences of the war converged. Veterans, families, merchants, and workers all contributed to the reshaping of daily life. Neighborhoods expanded outward from the city center. New streets were laid out to accommodate growth. Some followed older paths. Others were newly planned as part of a more structured urban layout. Gradually, Nashville began to take on a more modern appearance, not in a sudden transformation, but through steady accumulation of change. At the same time, new industries began to emerge. Manufacturing increased in importance. Small factories and workshops appeared near transportation hubs. These businesses produced goods that supported both local needs and regional markets. Tools, textiles, food products, and other items that reflected a growing and diversifying economy. The presence of railroads made it easier for these industries to expand their reach beyond the immediate region. Education and healthcare also continued to grow during this period. Institutions that had been disrupted or repurposed during the war began to stabilize again. Schools reopened. New educational programs were developed. Medical facilities expanded their services as the population grew. These developments helped reinforce Nashville's role as a regional center, not just for trade or politics, but for services and institutions that supported everyday life. Even as the city changed, the rhythm of daily life remained familiar in many ways. Markets still opened in the mornings. Farmers still brought goods from surrounding areas. Families still organized their days around work, meals, and seasonal cycles. But now these routines existed alongside new systems of transportation and industry. The older and newer versions of Nashville overlapped, creating a layered sense of time within the city itself. One of the most visible signs of change was the gradual expansion of urban development. Areas that had once been on the edge of town began to fill in with housing and businesses. Streets became more defined. Public infrastructure slowly improved. Lighting, roads, and municipal services began to develop in response to a growing population. Yet even with these changes, Nashville retained elements of its earlier character. The Cumberland River still flowed through the center of its identity. Rail lines followed natural corridors shaped by geography, and older neighborhoods preserved traces of earlier architectural styles and settlement patterns. Reconstruction was not just about rebuilding what had been lost. It was about adapting to a new set of realities: economic, social, and technological. The city was learning how to function in a post-war world where speed, connection, and infrastructure played a much larger role than before. By the end of this period, Nashville had not only recovered from the disruptions of war, it had begun to evolve into something more complex. A city where railroads and rivers worked together, where new industries grew alongside older agricultural connections, and where the memory of conflict remained part of the landscape, even as daily life moved forward. The transformation was ongoing, not finished, not complete, but clearly underway. And as the city continued to rebuild, it began to step into a new phase of growth, one shaped not only by what had been lost, but also by what was now possible. As Nashville moved further into the late 19th century, the pace of change began to feel different. Faster, more connected, more outward-looking than at any previous point in its history. The railroads that had begun to expand during the Reconstruction era now became the defining force of the city's development. Where the Cumberland River had once been the primary artery of movement and trade, rail lines now stretched in multiple directions, linking Nashville to cities far beyond the regional landscape. Memphis, Louisville, Atlanta, and many smaller towns and industrial centers in between. The arrival and expansion of railroads changed not only how goods moved, but how people experienced distance itself. Journeys that once took days or weeks along rivers and rough roads could now be completed in hours. This shift reshaped commerce almost immediately. Farm products from surrounding counties could reach urban markets more efficiently. Manufactured goods could be distributed more widely, and Nashville found itself positioned at the center of an increasingly complex network of exchange. Rail yards became some of the most active areas in the city. Long lines of freight cars stood beside warehouses and loading platforms. Workers moved constantly between trains, sorting, lifting, and organizing cargo. The rhythm of the rail system was different from the river. Less seasonal, more scheduled, more structured around human planning than natural flow. As rail infrastructure expanded, so too did industrial development. Factories began to appear in greater numbers across the city. These were not large industrial complexes by modern standards, but they represented a clear shift in economic life. Work that had once been entirely home-based or small-scale was increasingly centralized. Production became more organized, more mechanized, and more consistent. Warehouses, mills, and workshops clustered near rail lines and transportation hubs. These areas formed a new industrial geography within the city, distinct from older residential and civic districts. At the same time, Nashville's population continued to grow. People arrived from surrounding rural areas seeking employment in new industries. Others came from further away, drawn by the city's expanding role as a regional center. This growth placed new demands on infrastructure. Streets needed to be widened and improved. Housing expanded outward into new neighborhoods, and public services gradually adapted to the needs of a larger, more complex population. One of the most visible changes during this period was the introduction and expansion of streetcars. These early forms of urban transportation connected neighborhoods to the downtown core, allowing people to move more easily between work, home, and commercial areas. The streetcar lines followed major roads and gradually encouraged development along their routes. Neighborhoods began to form around accessibility. Distance from the city center became less limiting, and the shape of the city started to stretch outward in more defined patterns. This period is often associated with what is broadly called the Gilded Age, a time of rapid industrial growth and urban transformation across the United States. In Nashville, this transformation was visible in both large-scale infrastructure and everyday life. New buildings began to appear downtown, reflecting more elaborate architectural styles. Brick and stone structures replaced many older wooden ones in central areas. Commercial districts grew denser, with shops, offices, and institutions occupying increasingly valuable urban space. Yet even as the city modernized, older layers of its identity remained visible. The river still flowed through its center. Rail lines often followed paths shaped by earlier geographic and settlement patterns, and older neighborhoods continued to reflect earlier stages of development. This layering gave Nashville a distinctive character during this period. It was not a city that had replaced its past. It was a city that had added to it. One of the most significant effects of railroad expansion was the increased integration of Nashville into national markets. Goods produced in the city were no longer limited to regional distribution. They could reach distant states more easily, and in return, products from across the country flowed into Nashville with greater regularity. This exchange broadened the economic and cultural experience of daily life. Stores carried a wider variety of goods. Businesses operated on larger scales, and the city's economic identity became more closely tied to national patterns of industrial growth. Education and public institutions also expanded during this time. As wealth and population increased, new schools, libraries, and civic organizations were established or strengthened. These institutions reflected a growing emphasis on structure and civic development. Healthcare systems also began to modernize, with hospitals becoming more formalized and better equipped to serve a growing urban population. Despite all of this change, daily life still retained familiar rhythms. Markets remained active spaces of exchange. Families still organized their lives around work and seasonal patterns, and communities still formed around neighborhoods, churches, and shared local experiences. The difference was not that older ways disappeared. It was that they now existed alongside new systems of industrial and urban life. Transportation, communication, and commerce had all become more interconnected, and Nashville, positioned at the crossroads of river and rail, found itself increasingly shaped by both. By the end of the 19th century, the city had taken on a more modern form, not fully industrial like the largest northern cities, but no longer primarily frontier or river-based in character. It had become a hybrid city, one shaped by agriculture, industry, transportation, and governance all at once. And as the trains continued to arrive and depart on fixed schedules, Nashville moved steadily into a new era, one defined by speed, connection, and an expanding sense of place within a rapidly changing nation. As the 19th century drew toward its close, Nashville found itself in a moment of reflection and ambition. The city had grown through frontier settlement, river trade, political importance, wartime occupation, and industrial expansion. Now, it looked toward how it wanted to be seen, not just as a functional center of commerce or governance, but as a city with cultural identity and historical presence. In 1897, Nashville hosted the Tennessee Centennial Exposition. It marked 100 years since Tennessee's admission to the Union, and it offered the city an opportunity to present itself on a larger stage. The exposition was built as a temporary World's Fair-style event, drawing visitors from across the region and beyond. For a brief period, a large area of the city was transformed into exhibition grounds. Buildings rose that were designed not just for function, but for display. Pavilions, halls, and landscaped walkways created a space that felt separate from the everyday rhythm of Nashville life. Visitors walked through displays of industry, agriculture, technology, and art. They saw examples of the region's development, its progress, its aspirations. The exposition was not just about what Tennessee had been. It was about what it hoped to become. Among the many structures built for the event, one stood out both at the time and in memory. A full-scale replica of the Parthenon in Athens. Constructed as part of the fair's celebration of classical ideals, it was meant to symbolize education, culture, and civic aspiration. At the time, it was built from temporary materials, plaster and wood, a structure intended to last only for the duration of the exposition. But something about it captured the imagination of the city. The Parthenon connected Nashville's nickname, the Athens of the South, to a physical form. It gave shape to an idea that had been developing for decades, that Nashville was not only a center of trade and politics, but also a place that valued learning, culture, and civic identity. During the exposition, the grounds were filled with activity. Visitors moved between exhibits showcasing agriculture, machinery, and regional craftsmanship. There were demonstrations of new technologies that reflected the rapid industrial changes of the era. Electric lighting, mechanical devices, and transportation innovations all appeared as symbols of modern progress. Music and performances were also part of the atmosphere. Bands played in open spaces. Crowds gathered in temporary halls. The entire event had a sense of movement and curiosity. A city briefly turned outward to the wider world. When the exposition ended, most of the temporary structures were dismantled. The fairgrounds quieted, and life in Nashville returned to its regular rhythm. But the Parthenon replica remained in memory. It had become more than just a temporary exhibition piece. It had become a symbol. In the years that followed, it would be rebuilt more permanently, reflecting the city's continued attachment to the idea it represented. A commitment to education, to culture, to civic aspiration rooted in classical ideals. Even beyond the exposition itself, the centennial period marked an important moment in Nashville's identity. It reflected how far the city had come since its early frontier days, and how it now sought to define itself not only through industry or geography, but through cultural meaning. At the same time, the broader city continued to evolve in quieter, more gradual ways. Industrial growth persisted. Railroads remained central to commerce. New buildings and neighborhoods continued to expand outward from the city center. But the Centennial Exposition created a moment of pause within that ongoing change. A chance for reflection. A chance to present a vision of what the city believed it had become. The idea of Nashville as a cultural center began to take deeper root during this period. Schools and universities continued to grow. Libraries expanded their collections. public institutions placed increasing emphasis on education and civic development. The nickname, the Athens of the South, gained further resonance, not as a formal title, but as a widely understood description of the city's aspirations. Yet even as Nashville embraced cultural identity, it remained grounded in its existing foundations. Agriculture still shaped the surrounding region. Railroads still carried goods through its industrial corridors, and the Cumberland River still flowed through the heart of its geography and history. The Centennial Exposition did not replace these realities. It added another layer to them, a symbolic layer, one that connected Nashville's practical development with its cultural ambitions. In the quiet after the fair, as the exhibition grounds returned to open space and memory, the city continued forward. But something had shifted. Nashville had shown itself, even briefly, as a place capable of imagining itself on a grander scale, and that imagination would continue to shape its identity long after the Centennial lights had faded. Long before Nashville was known as Music City, before recording studios and radio stations, before crowds gathered for performances that would be heard around the world, music already existed here, not as an industry, not as a destination, but as something quieter, something woven into everyday life. In the early and mid-1800s, music in Nashville was not separated from daily activity. It was part of it. It moved through homes, churches, gatherings, and open spaces in a way that felt natural rather than performed. One of the most consistent places where music could be heard was the church. In early Nashville, churches were more than places of worship. They were gathering spaces, community centers, places where people shared news, comfort, and connection. Singing was a central part of that experience. Hymns echoed through wooden buildings, carried by voices that did not need training or formal instruction. They were simple, repetitive, memorized over time through repetition rather than written performance. And yet, they stayed in memory long after the service ended. Outside the church, music took on different forms. In homes, families often sang together in the evenings, not for performance, but for companionship, a way to pass time as daylight faded and the day's work came to a close. Songs were learned by ear, passed from parents to children, shared between neighbors, carried across generations in fragments and variations. In the wider region surrounding Nashville, folk traditions were deeply rooted in the cultural landscape. People brought songs with them as they moved into Tennessee from other parts of the United States. Ballads from the Appalachian regions, tunes influenced by European traditions, rhythms shaped by African musical heritage. Over time, these influences began to blend in subtle ways, not through formal planning, but through proximity, through shared space and shared experience. Music also traveled along the same routes as people and goods. Riverboats on the Cumberland did not only carry cargo, they carried sound. Workers sang while loading and unloading supplies. Travelers shared songs during long journeys, and as people moved between towns and settlements, they brought those songs with them. In this way, the river became not only a path for commerce, but also a quiet channel for cultural exchange. In town, early performance spaces began to appear, though they were simple by modern standards. Small halls, public rooms, occasional traveling shows that passed through Nashville on their way to other destinations. These performances were not yet part of a structured entertainment industry. They were temporary, fleeting, but they left impressions on those who attended. At the same time, traveling musicians played an important role in shaping the city's early musical identity. They moved from town to town, bringing instruments, songs, and styles that local audiences had not heard before. A fiddle tune from one region, a ballad from another, a style of singing shaped by entirely different landscapes. Each performance added something new to the local soundscape, not replacing what was already there, but layering on top of it. African American musical traditions were also deeply present in the region during this period, though often under difficult and constrained circumstances. Enslaved communities carried musical practices rooted in rhythm, call and response, and oral tradition. These musical forms were not separate from daily life. They were part of it, used in work, in communication, in moments of personal expression and communal gathering. Over time, these traditions influenced the broader musical environment of the region in ways that would become more visible in later decades. In early Nashville, however, these influences existed in parallel layers. Church music, folk traditions, traveling performances, community songs, each with its own origin, its own purpose, and its own setting. There was no single defining style, only a mixture of sounds shaped by the people who lived there. As the 19th century progressed, education and cultural institutions in Nashville began to grow, and with them came more structured forms of musical instruction. Music could now be studied more formally in certain settings. Though still limited, these early efforts helped shift music from purely informal practice toward something that could also be taught and refined. At the same time, technological and social changes were beginning to reshape how sound traveled. Printing technology made it easier to distribute sheet music. Railroads allowed performers to travel more widely, and cities became more connected through increasingly regular movement of people and ideas. Nashville was not yet a musical capital, but it was becoming a place where music could gather, where different traditions met, where styles overlapped and slowly influenced one another. By the late 1800s, these quiet foundations were firmly in place. Church hymns, folk songs, riverboat work chants, traveling performances, community gatherings, each one contributing in its own way to a growing cultural environment. Still, none of it was recognized as a defining identity at the time. It was simply part of life, part of the background rhythm of a growing city. But looking back, it becomes clear that something important was forming beneath the surface. Not yet a destination for music, not yet a center for recording or performance, but a place where music had already learned to live, quietly, continuously, and everywhere at once. And as Nashville moved toward the end of the 19th century, those early sounds did not disappear. They remained, waiting for the moment when they would become something larger than anyone living there at the time could fully imagine. By the early 20th century, Nashville had already been shaped by many identities. A river town, a capital city, a rail hub, a growing center of education and culture. But beneath all of these layers, something else was beginning to take form, something that would eventually define the city in the eyes of the world. Music was no longer just part of daily life. It was beginning to become an industry. The change did not happen all at once. It emerged gradually, through new technologies, new businesses, and new ways of sharing sound across distance. One of the most important developments was the rise of radio broadcasting. For the first time, music could travel without physical movement. It no longer needed a riverboat, a train, or a traveling performer. It could move through the air, invisible, immediate, and far-reaching. Radio stations began to appear in Nashville in the early 20th century, experimenting with this new form of communication. At first, broadcasts were simple. Live performances transmitted to small regional audiences. Local musicians played in studios that were often modest in size and equipment. But even these early broadcasts created something new. A shared listening experience that extended beyond a single room or building. Among the most influential early forces in this transformation was a station that would become deeply connected to Nashville's identity, WSM. Originally launched as a general broadcasting station, it soon became known for something more specific: music programming, especially live performances that reflected regional styles and traditions. Through WSM, Nashville's musical culture began to reach listeners far beyond the city itself. And it was through this same station that another defining institution emerged: the Grand Ole Opry. What began as a simple radio program of live music and performance gradually grew into a cultural landmark. Early broadcasts featured a mix of country, folk, and popular styles of the time. Musicians gathered in studio spaces, performing live for audiences who were not physically present, but connected through radio receivers in homes across the region. There was no elaborate stage at first. No large theater. Just performers, microphones, and the simple act of playing music in real time. But the impact was significant. For many listeners, it was the first time they experienced live music from outside their immediate community on a regular basis. The Grand Ole Opry became a place where different musical traditions could exist side by side. Fiddle tunes, gospel songs, story-based ballads, and early forms of what would later be recognized as country music. As the program grew in popularity, it began to attract performers from outside Nashville. Musicians traveled to the city specifically to appear on the broadcast. This steady flow of talent helped transform Nashville from a regional center of music activity into something more focused and defined. A destination. At the same time, recording technology was improving. Sound could now be captured, stored, and reproduced. This allowed music to exist beyond a single live performance. A song could be recorded once and heard many times in different places. This shift changed the relationship between musicians and audiences. Music was no longer only something experienced in person. It could be distributed, shared, repeated. And as recording studios began to appear in Nashville, the city's role in the music world continued to expand. Publishers, producers, and talent scouts began to take interest in the region. Sheet music publishing also played an important role in this early industry. Before widespread recordings, printed music allowed songs to travel across the country in written form. Nashville became a place where songs could be written, refined, and distributed to a wider audience. Over time, these developments reinforced one another. Radio brought music into homes. Recordings preserved performances. Publishing spread songs across regions. And live performances connected artists to audiences in a more direct way. Nashville sat at the center of this growing system, not by sudden design, but through a combination of geography, culture, and timing. Railroads still played a role, bringing performers and visitors into the city, and existing cultural traditions provided a foundation for musical expression that could be developed further. Church music, folk traditions, and regional performance styles all continued to influence what was being created and shared. As the 20th century progressed, more musicians began to settle in Nashville, not just passing through, but staying, writing, recording, performing, and building careers within the city itself. This gradual concentration of talent helped solidify Nashville's emerging identity. By the mid-1900s, The idea of Nashville as Music City had begun to take hold. It was not a formal designation at first, more of an observation, a recognition of what had already become visible through years of development. Music was everywhere in the city, in studios, on the radio, in churches, in performance halls, and in the everyday lives of people who worked within the growing industry. Yet even as this identity strengthened, it did not erase Nashville's earlier roles. The river still flowed. The government institutions still functioned. The universities and hospitals still expanded. Music became an additional layer, not a replacement. Another thread woven into the city's long and evolving history. By the time Nashville fully stepped into its reputation as Music City, it had already spent more than a century becoming something else as well. A place where sound could gather, where traditions could merge, and where new forms of expression could take root and grow. And as radio waves carried music outward from the city, Nashville itself began to resonate in a new way, quietly transforming from a regional center into a cultural landmark whose influence would soon reach far beyond the banks of the Cumberland River. By the mid-20th century, Nashville had fully entered a new phase of development. The city was no longer defined primarily by its early frontier origins, nor was it shaped only by river trade, railroads, or its role as a state capital. Instead, it had become a modern urban center, influenced by national trends in transportation, education, healthcare, and industry. The pace of life had changed noticeably from earlier generations. Faster movement, greater connectivity, and a more complex urban structure that extended far beyond the original boundaries of the settlement along the Cumberland River. One of the most visible forces shaping this period was suburban expansion. As transportation improved, especially with the rise of highways and increased automobile use, people were no longer required to live near the city center in the same way they once were. Neighborhoods began to spread outward in all directions. Residential areas developed in what had previously been farmland or lightly developed land. This shift changed the shape of the city. Instead of a compact core surrounded by rural land, Nashville became a more spread-out metropolitan area, connected by roads, highways, and later interstate systems. The introduction of major highway infrastructure in the mid-20th century reinforced this transformation. Large roadways cut through and around the city, linking Nashville to other major urban centers across the region. Travel became faster and more flexible. Commuting became a part of everyday life for many residents. People could live farther from where they worked, studied, or shopped, and this separation of space created new patterns of urban development. Downtown Nashville also began to change during this period. Older buildings were renovated, replaced, or repurposed as the needs of the growing city shifted. Commercial districts expanded vertically as well as horizontally. Office buildings grew taller. New architectural styles reflected modern design trends, emphasizing functionality and scale. At the same time, efforts were made to maintain and preserve certain historic areas, creating a contrast between old and new within the urban landscape. Education continued to expand significantly during this period. Universities and colleges grew in size and influence, attracting students from across the country. Academic programs diversified, reflecting broader changes in society and the economy. Research, professional training, and specialized fields of study became increasingly important. These institutions helped establish Nashville not only as a regional center, but as a destination for higher education. Healthcare also became one of the city's defining sectors. Hospitals and medical centers expanded in both capacity and complexity. New facilities were built to accommodate advances in medical technology and growing population needs. Medical education and research became closely tied to these institutions, further strengthening Nashville's role as a center for healthcare in the region. As these systems developed, the city's economy became more diversified. No longer dependent on a single industry or transportation mode, Nashville's growth was supported by multiple interconnected sectors: education, healthcare, government, transportation, and an increasingly important cultural and entertainment industry. Music, already established as part of Nashville's identity by the mid-1900s, continued to grow in influence during this period. Recording studios expanded, performance venues multiplied, and the city attracted musicians, producers, and industry professionals from across the country. This cultural growth reinforced Nashville's reputation as a place where music was not only performed, but also created and shaped on a professional level. Despite these modern developments, the city still retained visible connections to its past. The Cumberland River continued to flow through its center, a reminder of the original settlement and its earliest days. Historic neighborhoods preserved architectural styles from earlier eras, and older institutions remained active alongside newer ones, creating a layered sense of time within the city. Daily life in modern Nashville reflected this blend of continuity and change. Commuters traveled along highways that did not exist a generation earlier. Students attended universities that had grown from small regional institutions into major centers of learning. Patients received care in hospitals equipped with advanced technology, and residents moved through a city that was constantly adapting to new demands while still carrying traces of its earlier identity. By the late 20th century, Nashville had become a metropolitan area with national significance. Its population continued to grow, its economy became more complex, and its cultural influence extended far beyond Tennessee. Yet even as it expanded outward, the city remained connected to the same geographic and historical foundations that had shaped it from the beginning. The river, the valley, the crossroads of transportation and settlement. Modern Nashville was not a departure from its past. It was an accumulation of it, each era adding another layer, each transformation building upon what came before. And as the city continued into the present day, it carried all of these layers together: frontier town, capital city, rail hub, cultural center, and modern metropolis, existing simultaneously within the same evolving landscape. When you look at Nashville today, it can feel like a single, unified city. Busy streets, modern buildings, music drifting through venues and open spaces. But underneath that surface, the city is still many different versions of itself at once, each one built on top of the last, each one still present in some quiet way. At its center, the Cumberland River continues to flow, just as it did for the earliest settlers who arrived in the late 1700s. It curves through the city not as a boundary anymore, but as a constant reminder of origin, a thread that ties present-day Nashville to its earliest days as a frontier settlement surrounded by forest and uncertainty. Along its banks, you can still find traces of every stage of the city's development. Old industrial structures near newer developments, bridges connecting neighborhoods that once felt distant from one another, walking paths where riverboats once carried goods slowly downstream toward distant markets. The river has seen Nashville change in ways that are almost difficult to fully imagine. From Fort Nashborough's wooden stockade, to a state capital still finding its shape, to a river town tied to flatboats and trade, to a rail-connected industrial center, to a cultural and musical hub recognized far beyond Tennessee, and now to a modern metropolitan city that continues to grow and shift with each passing decade. Each of these identities still exists in some form, not as separate chapters left behind, but as layers that remain part of the same place. In the downtown core, glass and steel buildings reflect a modern skyline. Office towers, performance venues, hotels, and residential spaces form a dense urban environment shaped by economic and cultural activity. But just a few blocks away, older architecture still stands. Brick buildings from earlier industrial eras, historic theaters, churches that have been part of the city for over a century. These structures are not separate from modern Nashville. They exist alongside it, creating a sense of continuity across time. Music, too, remains a constant presence. What began as informal gatherings, church hymns, and folk traditions has grown into a global cultural identity. Studios, stages, and recording spaces are scattered throughout the city. Some are large and internationally known. Others are small, tucked into neighborhoods where creativity feels more intimate. Musicians still come to Nashville from all over the world. Some arrive seeking opportunity. Others come seeking connection to a tradition that has been building here for generations. The sound of the city is not one single style. It is a blend. Country, gospel, rock, blues, pop, and countless hybrid forms that reflect the diversity of people who live and work there. Education and healthcare continue to shape the city as well. Universities bring students from many places, adding new energy and ideas to the community. Medical centers serve both local residents and broader regional populations, continuing a long tradition of Nashville as a place of service and institution building. Transportation networks now extend far beyond what early settlers could have imagined. Highways, interstates, and airports connect Nashville to national and global systems of movement. But even with this modern infrastructure, the city's original geography still matters. The river valley still guides its shape. The surrounding hills still frame its expansion, and older roads still influence how neighborhoods connect. In quieter moments, it is still possible to sense earlier versions of the city, in the layout of certain streets, in the placement of older buildings, in the way some neighborhoods still follow patterns that began long before modern planning. Nashville does not exist as a single moment in time. It exists as a continuum, a place where the past is not gone, but absorbed, where each generation adds something new without fully erasing what came before. And so the city becomes something layered and ongoing, a frontier settlement that became a capital, a river town that became a rail hub, an industrial center that became a cultural landmark, and a modern city that continues to grow while still carrying all of those earlier identities within it. As the Cumberland River flows through the present-day skyline, it carries with it the memory of every stage of Nashville's history, not as separate stories, but as one continuous movement through time. And in that sense, the city is still becoming, still unfolding, still shaped by the same quiet forces of geography, people, and time that first brought it into existence along the river's edge. Nashville is no longer just a place on a map. It is a long, living accumulation of moments. And as day turns to night along the Cumberland, the city continues its slow, steady rhythm, holding its past and present together, and moving gently forward into whatever comes next. As the story of Nashville stretches back across centuries, it does not settle neatly into a single beginning or ending. Instead, it feels more like a long unfolding, a gradual layering of people, places, and purposes that never fully replace what came before, only add to it. At its earliest edge, Nashville was only a river valley, a stretch of land shaped by the Cumberland River, forests, wildlife, and seasonal rhythms that moved long before any settlement existed. Then came Fort Nashborough, a small, fragile collection of cabins surrounded by a wooden stockade, a place where survival depended on cooperation, labor, and the steady repetition of daily tasks that rarely felt remarkable in the moment, but became the foundation of everything that followed. From there, the settlement became a town, then a capital city, then a river-based center of trade, then a rail-connected hub of industry. Each stage did not erase the one before it. It simply changed its scale, its rhythm, its relationship to the world beyond it. The Cumberland River remained constant through all of it, first as a lifeline for survival, then as a highway for trade, and eventually as a quiet presence running through an increasingly modern city. Even as railroads arrived and highways followed, and industries reshaped the landscape, the river continued to move at its own pace, unhurried, unchanged in its direction, only surrounded by change. Across time, Nashville gathered identity after identity, a frontier settlement, a political center, a place of education and civic ambition, a city of plantations and surrounding rural economies, with all their contrasts and complexities, a city shaped by war and Reconstruction, a city transformed by railroads and industrial growth, and eventually a city where music began to rise into something larger than local tradition, something shared, something broadcast, something recognized far beyond its original borders. Music did not replace Nashville's earlier histories. It joined them, layered itself into the same streets, buildings, and institutions that had already been shaped by centuries of change. And so the city became something unusual, not defined by a single moment in time, but existing as many moments at once, frontier and modern, river town and metropolis, political center and cultural landmark. Even now, all of those versions remain present, in the layout of its streets, in the rhythm of its neighborhoods, in the flow of the Cumberland River as it passes beneath bridges that connect old and new parts of the city, and in the quiet spaces between movement and sound. Nashville continues to exist as it always has, a place shaped by geography, carried forward by people, and changed slowly over time, like water moving through land it has always known. As night settles over the Cumberland, the lights of the city reflect softly across the surface of the river, and for a moment everything feels layered and still. The past is not gone. The present is not separate from it. They exist together, flowing forward in the same direction, and in that quiet overlap, Nashville continues its long, ongoing story, unfolding gently, even as the city sleeps. Good night.